The grand ballroom of Buckingham Palace sparkled under the light of 1,000 crystals. President Emmanuel Macron and his wife Brigitte had arrived for what everyone believed would be a routine state banquet. The finest chefs had prepared 7 courses, the orchestra tuned their instruments, and photographers positioned themselves for the perfect shots. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, stood near the entrance greeting guests. She wore a stunning blue gown that caught the light with every movement. Her smile was warm and genuine as she shook hands with French dignitaries and British officials. Nobody suspected that this evening would change the course of British history forever. King Charles appeared more nervous than usual. Palace staff noticed he kept checking his watch and adjusting his tie. His private secretary had seen him rehearsing something in his study earlier that day, but when asked about it, the king simply waved him away. The weight of what he planned to announce pressed heavily on his shoulders. As guests took their seats, the atmosphere buzzed with polite conversation. Macron spoke enthusiastically about the strong friendship between Britain and France. British ministers discussed trade deals and cultural exchanges. Everyone expected speeches about cooperation and shared values. The evening felt perfectly normal, even elegant. Catherine noticed her father-in-law's unusual behavior. During the soup course, she caught him staring at her with an expression she couldn't read. When their eyes met, he gave her a small nod that seemed to carry enormous meaning. She felt a flutter of anxiety in her stomach but couldn't understand why. The king barely touched his food. His mind raced through the words he had carefully chosen for this moment. He thought about his mother, Queen Elizabeth, and the conversations they had shared about the future of the monarchy. He remembered her advice about making difficult decisions for the good of the nation, even when they seemed impossible. President Macron raised his glass for the traditional toast. The room fell silent as everyone prepared for the familiar words about friendship between nations. But King Charles stood up suddenly, his chair scraping against the marble floor. The sound echoed through the ballroom like a gunshot. "Ladies and gentlemen," the king began, his voice carrying across the hushed room, "before we continue with tonight's celebrations, I have an announcement that cannot wait." The atmosphere changed instantly. Forks stopped midway to mouths. Conversations died completely. Even the orchestra seemed to hold their breath. Catherine felt her heart begin to race. Something in the king's tone warned her that everything was about to change. She looked around the room and saw the same confusion reflected in every face. Macron leaned forward slightly, his diplomatic training keeping his expression neutral despite his obvious surprise. The king cleared his throat and looked directly at Catherine. In that moment, she knew that whatever came next would alter her life forever. The silence stretched like a taut wire, ready to snap with the weight of his words. After much consideration and prayer, King Charles continued, his voice steady despite the magnitude of his words. "I have decided that Catherine, Princess of Wales, will be my successor to the throne." The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Catherine's wineglass slipped from her fingers, shattering against the marble floor. The sound seemed to break the spell that had frozen the entire room. Gasps erupted from every corner. Chairs scraped as people turned to stare at her in disbelief. She felt the blood drain from her face as hundreds of eyes focused on her. President Macron's diplomatic composure cracked for just a moment. His eyebrows rose slightly before he caught himself and returned to his neutral expression. But inside his mind raced with the implications. This wasn't just a family matter. It was a constitutional earthquake that would ripple across Europe and the world. The king's private secretary nearly dropped his notepad. He had worked for the royal family for 20 years and thought he understood protocol better than anyone. Nothing in his training had prepared him for this moment. Traditional succession laws meant Prince William should inherit the throne, not his wife. Catherine's hands trembled as she tried to process what had just happened. She thought about William, who was visiting Australia on royal duties. He had no idea that his father was rewriting the rules of monarchy while he was on the other side of the world. How would he react when he learned about this from news reports? "Your Majesty," one of the British ministers finally found his voice. "Surely this requires parliamentary approval and constitutional review?" His question voiced what everyone was thinking but afraid to say. You couldn't simply change succession laws during a dinner party, no matter how royal the setting. King Charles raised his hand for silence. I have spent months consulting with constitutional experts and legal advisors. While unconventional, my decision is within my rights as sovereign. Catherine has proven herself to be an exceptional leader, a devoted mother, and someone who truly understands the needs of modern Britain. The French ambassador leaned over to his aide and whispered urgently in French. This development would require immediate communication with Paris. President Macron would need to reconsider every diplomatic relationship and treaty that Britain had with European nations. A female successor who wasn't born into royalty could change everything. Catherine finally found her voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. Your Majesty, I don't understand. This isn't how things work. William is your heir. Her words carried across the silent room, and everyone strained to hear her response to this unprecedented situation. William will understand, the king replied firmly. He knows as I do that sometimes we must break with tradition to serve the greater good. You have the qualities this nation needs for the challenges ahead. Your compassion, your intelligence, and your connection with the people make you the right choice. The room erupted into chaos as guests began talking all at once. Some pulled out their phones to send urgent messages. Others sat in stunned silence trying to comprehend what they had just witnessed. The carefully planned state banquet had become the setting for the most dramatic announcement in British royal history. Within minutes of the king's announcement, phones buzzed throughout the palace like angry bees. News of the dramatic declaration spread faster than wildfire. Palace staff rushed through corridors carrying urgent messages. The carefully orchestrated evening had transformed into controlled chaos. Catherine excused herself from the banquet, her legs feeling unsteady as she walked toward the palace's private quarters. Her mind spun with impossible thoughts. How could she possibly become queen? She had married into the family. But she had never imagined this scenario. The weight of potential responsibility felt crushing. In her private sitting room, she called William immediately. The phone rang several times before his sleepy voice answered from Australia. Catherine? Is everything all right? It's very early here. She could hear the concern in his voice, and her heart broke knowing she was about to deliver news that would shock him to his core. William, you need to sit down, she began, her voice shaking. Your father just announced something at the state banquet that I think you should hear from me first. She took a deep breath and told him everything. The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that she wondered if the call had dropped. Meanwhile, back in the banquet hall, President Macron made the best of an impossible situation. He raised his glass again and offered a toast to unexpected developments and the strength of the British people. His words were diplomatic perfection, but everyone could see the wheels turning behind his eyes as he calculated the political implications. The king's closest advisors gathered in an emergency meeting in the blue drawing room. Lord Chamberlain paced back and forth, his face red with frustration. Your Majesty, with all due respect, this could create a constitutional crisis. Parliament hasn't been consulted. The Church of England hasn't been informed. We could face legal challenges for years. Sometimes, the king replied calmly. Great changes require bold actions. My mother understood this when she modernized the monarchy throughout her reign. Catherine represents the future, someone who wasn't born into privilege but earned her place through dedication and service. Outside the palace gates, news vans began arriving as word spread through social media and news networks. Reporters scrambled to understand what had happened. Palace security increased their presence, knowing that by morning, crowds would gather seeking answers to questions that nobody knew how to answer. Catherine's phone rang constantly with calls from friends, family members, and officials. She let most go to voicemail, feeling overwhelmed by the attention. Her mother called 3 times before Catherine finally answered. Darling, what on earth is happening? The news is saying the most extraordinary things. In Australia, William sat in his hotel room staring at his phone after their conversation ended. His first instinct was to book the next flight home, but he realized that rushing back might make the situation worse. Instead, he called his father directly, needing to hear the explanation from the source. Father, what have you done? William's voice carried hurt and confusion. Catherine is wonderful, but this isn't how succession works. What about our children? What about the traditions that have guided our family for centuries? The king listened patiently to his son's concerns. William, I know this is difficult to understand, but I've been watching Catherine for years. She connects with people in ways that born royals sometimes struggle with. She understands modern Britain because she lived as a regular citizen before joining our family. Back at the banquet, guests pretended to continue eating while whispering urgent conversations. The French delegation sat uncomfortably, unsure whether to proceed with planned discussions about trade agreements. How could they negotiate with a government whose leadership structure had just been completely upended? Catherine returned to the banquet hall, knowing she couldn't hide forever. Every eye followed her as she took her seat. She felt like she was walking through a dream where nothing made sense. Just hours ago, she had been worried about making small talk with foreign diplomats. Now she faced the possibility of becoming the most powerful woman in Britain. By midnight, news of the king's announcement had reached every corner of Britain and beyond. Social media exploded with reactions ranging from shock to excitement to outrage. The hashtags "Honor Catherine Queen" and "Royal Revolution" trending worldwide as people tried to make sense of this unprecedented development. In living rooms across Britain, families gathered around television screens watching emergency news broadcasts. Political experts struggled to explain the constitutional implications, while royal historians debated whether such a dramatic change was even legal. Nobody had clear answers because nothing like this had ever happened before. Prime Minister's emergency advisors woke him at his country residence with urgent phone calls. The government faced a potential crisis that could shake the very foundations of British democracy. Constitutional lawyers were already being contacted to provide legal opinions on the king's authority to change succession laws without parliamentary approval. Catherine's former university friends watched the news in amazement. Sarah, her old roommate, called her sister in disbelief. Remember Catherine Middleton from uni? The one who worked at her parents' party supply company? She might become Queen of England. The idea seemed so impossible that many people wondered if it was an elaborate hoax. In Scotland, First Minister called an emergency cabinet meeting. If Catherine became queen, it could affect Scotland's relationship with the monarchy and potentially influence future independence discussions. The announcement created ripple effects that extended far beyond England's borders. Religious leaders across the country received urgent calls from news organizations seeking comments. The Archbishop of Canterbury released a brief statement saying the church needed time to pray and reflect on these developments. Behind closed doors, church officials worried about the theological implications of such a dramatic break with tradition. International stock markets opened to uncertainty as traders tried to gauge the impact of political instability in Britain. The pound fluctuated wildly as investors wondered whether this royal shakeup might affect Britain's government stability and international relationships. Catherine spent the night unable to sleep, walking through the palace gardens in the early morning darkness. She thought about her children sleeping peacefully upstairs, unaware that their lives might be about to change forever. How could she explain to George, Charlotte, and Louis that their mother might become queen instead of their father? Palace staff worked through the night fielding phone calls from world leaders, journalists, and government officials. The switchboard lit up like a Christmas tree as everyone sought information that nobody had. Even the palace's most experienced communications team had no protocol for this situation. William finally boarded a plane in Sydney, cutting his royal tour short despite his father's advice to stay. He needed to be home to support Catherine and to understand what this meant for their family. During the long flight, he had hours to think about his father's decision and what it revealed about the king's vision for the monarchy's future. In France, President Macron held emergency consultations with his advisors. This unexpected development could affect European Union relationships with Britain and change the diplomatic landscape. He needed to understand whether Catherine's potential succession would bring new opportunities or complications for Franco-British relations. The king spent the morning in his private study, reading reactions from around the world. Some praised his bold modernization of an ancient institution. Others criticized him for abandoning centuries of tradition. He had expected controversy, but seeing it unfold in real time felt overwhelming even for someone accustomed to public scrutiny. Legal experts worked frantically to research precedents and constitutional law. Oxford and Cambridge constitutional scholars found themselves thrust into the spotlight as news organizations sought expert opinions. The consensus seemed to be that while highly unusual, the king might have the authority to make such a declaration, though it would likely face significant legal challenges. Catherine's security detail quietly increased their presence around her and the children. The palace recognized that this announcement made the family targets for both increased public attention and potential security threats. Everything about their daily routines would need to be reconsidered and strengthened. As dawn broke over London, protesters and supporters began gathering outside Buckingham Palace. Some carried signs supporting Catherine's potential succession, while others demanded adherence to traditional succession laws. The crowd grew larger as the morning progressed, with police working to maintain order while allowing peaceful demonstration. William's plane touched down at Heathrow Airport to a media circus unlike anything he had ever experienced. Photographers and reporters surrounded the terminal, desperate for his reaction to his father's shocking announcement. His security team had to create a human shield to get him to the waiting car without being overwhelmed by shouting journalists. The drive to the palace felt longer than usual as William stared out the window at crowds gathering along the route. People held signs with messages ranging from "Long live Queen Catherine" to "Respect royal tradition." The division among the public was becoming clear, and he worried about what this meant for his family's future. Catherine waited for him in their private apartments, having barely slept since the previous evening. When William walked through the door, they embraced without speaking. Both understood that their world had shifted dramatically, and they needed to figure out together how to navigate these uncharted waters. "The children have been asking questions," Catherine told him quietly. "George heard something on the radio this morning before I could turn it off. He wanted to know why people were talking about Mummy becoming queen." The innocent curiosity of their eldest son highlighted how this decision would affect the next generation in ways nobody had fully considered. Meanwhile, Parliament prepared for an emergency session to discuss the constitutional implications of the king's announcement. Members from all parties demanded answers about the legality of changing succession without proper consultation. The Speaker of the House faced the unprecedented challenge of managing a debate about something that had never happened in British history. Prime Minister arrived at Downing Street to find protesters already gathering outside. His advisors handed him briefing papers outlining the potential legal challenges and political ramifications. The government faced pressure to either support the king's decision or challenge it through constitutional means, both options carrying significant risks. Inside Buckingham Palace, the king met with his most trusted advisors to plan their response to the growing controversy. Lord Chamberlain presented him with a folder full of legal opinions, most suggesting that while the announcement was dramatic, it might not be legally binding without proper parliamentary procedures. "Your Majesty," the Archbishop of Canterbury said during an urgent private meeting, "the Church has concerns about the precedent this sets. Marriage into the royal family has never before qualified someone for direct succession to the throne. We need clarity on the religious implications of this decision." Catherine found herself studying constitutional law books that palace librarians brought to her apartments. If she was truly going to be considered for succession, she needed to understand the legal framework surrounding the monarchy. The complexity of centuries-old laws and traditions felt overwhelming. International reaction continued to pour in throughout the day. The President of the United States issued a diplomatic statement, supporting the British people's right to determine their own leadership structures. Other Commonwealth nations expressed confusion about how this might affect their relationship with the British Crown Prince. Harry called from California, having seen the news on American television. His conversation with William was tense, as Harry struggled to understand why their father would make such a dramatic decision without consulting the family. The brothers, already dealing with their own relationship challenges, found this new crisis adding strain to their communication. Queen Consort Camilla maintained her scheduled appointments despite the chaos, but palace observers noted her unusually quiet demeanor. As the king's wife, she understood better than most the weight of royal responsibility, and she worried about the burden being placed on Catherine's shoulders. Legal challenges began filing in courts across Britain. Constitutional lawyers representing various interest groups argued that the king had exceeded his authority. The cases would likely take months or years to resolve, creating ongoing uncertainty about the monarchy's future leadership structure. Catherine's parents watched the news coverage from their home in Berkshire, feeling helpless as their daughter faced unprecedented scrutiny. Michael and Carol Middleton had always been proud of Catherine's role in the royal family, but this development brought attention and pressure they had never imagined possible. Evening polls showed the British public deeply divided. Younger generations seemed more open to the idea of Catherine's succession, viewing it as a modernization of an outdated system. Older citizens expressed concern about abandoning traditions that had guided the monarchy for centuries. As night fell, William and Catherine walked through Kensington Gardens together, surrounded by discreet security. They talked quietly about their options, knowing that whatever they decided would affect not just their own lives but the future of the British monarchy. The weight of history pressed down on them both. The king spent the evening alone in his study, reading letters from citizens across the Commonwealth. Some praised his bold vision for modernizing the monarchy. Others expressed disappointment and anger at what they saw as a betrayal of royal traditions. Each letter reminded him of the enormous responsibility he carried as sovereign. 3 days after the shocking announcement, Catherine requested a private meeting with the king. She had spent sleepless nights weighing the enormous responsibility being offered to her against the disruption it would cause to her family and the nation. The decision she was about to make would change everything. She walked through the palace corridors with a newfound sense of purpose, having finally reached clarity about her path forward. The portraits of previous monarchs seemed to watch her as she passed, their painted eyes reflecting centuries of royal duty and sacrifice. She understood now that some decisions transcended personal comfort. "Your Majesty," Catherine began as she entered the king's private study, "I need to speak honestly about your announcement." The king looked up from his desk, where constitutional law books and legal opinions lay scattered like puzzle pieces. He could see in her expression that she had made up her mind. "I've been thinking about what you said regarding the needs of modern Britain," she continued, taking a seat across from him. "You mentioned that sometimes we must break with tradition to serve the greater good. I believe you're right, but I also believe there's a better way to achieve your vision." The king listened intently as Catherine presented her alternative proposal. Instead of bypassing William in the succession, she suggested creating a new role that would allow her to modernize the monarchy while working alongside the traditional heir. Her idea involved expanding the duties of the Princess of Wales to include direct constitutional responsibilities. "William is ready to be king," Catherine explained. "He's been preparing for this role his entire life, but I can help him bridge the gap between royal tradition and contemporary expectations. We can modernize together, as partners, rather than throwing away centuries of established protocol." Her words carried weight because they came from someone who had lived both as a commoner and as a royal. She understood the challenges facing both worlds and believed she could help create connections without destroying the foundations that had kept the monarchy stable for generations. The king sat quietly for several minutes, considering her proposal. He had made his dramatic announcement because he genuinely believed Catherine possessed qualities the monarchy needed. But he had not fully considered the alternative of expanding her role within the existing structure, rather than completely restructuring succession. "Your proposal has merit," he finally admitted, "but it would require its own constitutional changes. Parliament would need to approve expanding royal duties and responsibilities. The legal framework would be almost as complex as what I originally suggested." Catherine had anticipated this concern. Yes, but it wouldn't require breaking the fundamental principle of hereditary succession. "We would be adding to tradition rather than abandoning it. The public response suggests people are ready for change, but perhaps not for such a dramatic break with the past." That evening, Catherine and William met with parliamentary leaders to discuss the modified proposal. The politicians seemed relieved to have an option that honored tradition while addressing calls for modernization. Several members expressed enthusiasm for Catherine's expanded role idea, seeing it as a compromise that could satisfy various constituencies. Prime Minister privately admitted that Catherine's alternative approach offered a path forward that wouldn't require lengthy constitutional battles in courts. The government could support expanding royal duties through existing legislative processes rather than defending unprecedented changes to succession laws. News of Catherine's alternative proposal leaked to the media within hours, creating a new wave of public discussion. Royal commentators praised her diplomatic approach to resolving the crisis her father-in-law had created. Many saw her solution as evidence of the exact kind of thoughtful leadership the monarchy needed. Public opinion polls showed strong support for Catherine's compromise proposal. Citizens appreciated that she had found a way to modernize the monarchy without abandoning its historical foundations. Her approach demonstrated respect for tradition while acknowledging the need for change. The king called another family meeting, this time including William, Catherine, and key advisors. The discussion lasted several hours as they worked through the details of how an expanded role for Catherine might function. Legal experts outlined the legislative process required to formalize such changes. International observers noted that Catherine's alternative approach could serve as a model for other constitutional monarchies facing pressure to modernize. Her solution balanced respect for tradition with recognition of contemporary expectations, potentially influencing royal institutions worldwide. By the end of the week, it became clear that Catherine's diplomatic intervention had successfully redirected the national conversation. Instead of arguing about breaking succession laws, people were discussing how to evolve the monarchy while preserving its essential character. The king announced that he would consider Catherine's proposal seriously, and that any final decisions would involve proper consultation with Parliament and constitutional experts. His willingness to reconsider his original announcement demonstrated the same flexibility he had originally praised in Catherine. Catherine felt enormous relief that she had found a way to honor the king's confidence in her abilities while protecting her family from unnecessary upheaval. Her solution offered the possibility of meaningful change without the constitutional crisis that had threatened to tear apart the institution she had married into. 6 months later, the Palace of Westminster buzzed with anticipation as Parliament prepared to vote on the Royal Duties Expansion Act. Catherine's proposal had evolved through extensive consultation into legislation that would create new constitutional responsibilities for the Princess of Wales while maintaining traditional succession laws. Catherine sat in the public gallery watching as members of Parliament debated the bill that bore her name. The months of negotiation and compromise had been exhausting, but seeing her vision take concrete form filled her with quiet pride. She had successfully navigated the most challenging period of her royal life. The king watched from his private office as live coverage showed overwhelming parliamentary support for the legislation. His original announcement at the state banquet had created a crisis, but Catherine's diplomatic response had transformed that crisis into meaningful reform. He felt proud of both his bold vision and her wise guidance. William stood beside his wife in the gallery, understanding now that his father's dramatic announcement had been the catalyst needed to modernize the monarchy. While the king's method had been shocking, the result was exactly what the institution needed to remain relevant for future generations. Prime Minister rose to address Parliament for the final time before the vote. "This legislation represents the best of British democracy," he declared. "We have taken a moment of uncertainty and transformed it into an opportunity for positive change. The Princess of Wales will now have formal constitutional duties that reflect her unique qualifications and the public's trust in her judgment." The vote was not even close. Members from all parties supported the expansion of Catherine's role, recognizing that her proposal had solved multiple challenges facing the modern monarchy. The bill passed with the largest majority seen in Parliament for decades, demonstrating rare unity in British politics. Outside Westminster, crowds gathered to celebrate the peaceful resolution of what had begun as a constitutional crisis. Signs reading "Thank you, Catherine" and "Modern Monarchy" reflected public appreciation for her leadership in finding a solution that honored both tradition and progress. President Macron, watching from Paris, smiled as he remembered that dramatic state banquet 6 months earlier. What had seemed like a diplomatic disaster had evolved into an inspiring example of how democratic institutions could adapt and grow. He looked forward to working with Britain's newly strengthened constitutional framework. Catherine's expanded role would include direct involvement in Commonwealth relations, environmental policy, and social welfare initiatives. Parliament had granted her authority to speak on behalf of the Crown in these areas, making her the first royal family member other than the monarch to hold such constitutional responsibilities. The children had grown accustomed to the increased attention their mother received, though palace staff worked carefully to protect their privacy. George, now old enough to understand some of what had happened, told his mother he was proud that she had helped fix things for their family. Legal challenges to the original succession announcement were withdrawn once the new legislation passed. Constitutional lawyers acknowledged that Catherine's alternative approach had successfully modernized the monarchy without creating the legal uncertainties that would have resulted from changing succession laws. International reaction was overwhelmingly positive. Other constitutional monarchies began studying the British model as a potential framework for their own modernization efforts. Catherine found herself invited to speak at conferences about constitutional reform and democratic evolution. The king's approval ratings recovered completely as the public came to understand that his dramatic announcement had been the catalyst for positive change. Royal historians noted that sometimes disruptive leadership was necessary to break through institutional resistance to needed reforms. 1 year after the state banquet announcement, Catherine hosted her own diplomatic dinner featuring leaders from across the Commonwealth. She used the occasion to demonstrate how her expanded role was strengthening relationships between Britain and its traditional allies while building new partnerships. Worldwide, the anniversary provided an opportunity to reflect on how dramatically things had changed. What began as a shocking breach of protocol had evolved into a new model for constitutional monarchy that balanced tradition with contemporary expectations. Catherine's leadership had proven that crisis could become opportunity. With the right vision and diplomacy, William often remarked privately that his wife's handling of the succession crisis had prepared her perfectly for her future role as queen consort. Her combination of respect for tradition and willingness to embrace change would serve the monarchy well when their time came to lead. As Catherine looked back on that dramatic evening when everything changed, she realized that sometimes the most important moments in history happened not through careful planning but through bold actions that forced everyone to consider new possibilities. The king's announcement had been shocking, but it had opened doors to changes that might have taken decades to achieve through conventional means. The monarchy emerged stronger, more relevant, and better prepared for the challenges of the modern world. Catherine's diplomatic solution had proven that with wisdom, patience, and respect for both tradition and progress, even the most dramatic crises could lead to positive transformation.